He didn't knock. He didn't warn her. Gideon Harrow simply walked into Silas Boone's kitchen like he owned it, because in his mind, he owned everything in this valley. And he grabbed the little girl by the wrist. "This child doesn't belong to you," he said, not to Mara, not to Silas. He said it to the room, like the child wasn't even there, like she was a deed, a document, a thing to be transferred. The girl didn't scream, she just looked at Mara with those wide, terrified eyes, and that silence, that heartbreaking practiced silence of a child who had learned that screaming only made things worse. That was the moment everything changed. If that were your child, what would you do? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way through. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach came in on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign because nothing good ever arrived in Stone Ridge on a Tuesday. It was the kind of morning that made the desert feel personal. The sun beating down with a specific hatred, the dust rising in slow, lazy columns off the main road like the land itself was exhaling. 3 weeks without rain. The creek at the east end of town had dropped 2 feet since May. The Hendersons had already sold off half their cattle at a loss, and the word drought had stopped being a conversation and started being a prayer that nobody believed in anymore. Silas Boone was standing outside the general store when the coach pulled up. He had his hat in his hands, which was unusual because Silas was not the kind of man who fidgeted. I was 41 years old, built like a fence post that had weathered 20 winters, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite as the mountain ridge behind his ranch. He didn't talk much. He didn't have to. The quiet around him had always been enough. But today his hands were working the brim of that hat like it owed him money, and the 4 men standing near the water trough noticed. "That her?" said Roy Casper, who ran the feed store and made it his business to know everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. "Probably," said Silas. "You sure about this, Boone?" Silas didn't answer. The stage door swung open. The first thing that came out was a worn leather bag, dropped onto the step by a hand that clearly didn't expect any help receiving it. Then a boot. Practical, dusty, resolute. Then Mara Whitlock stepped down into Stone Ridge, and she stood for exactly 1 second with her hand on the coach door, looking at the town the way a person looks at something they're trying to memorize before it disappears. She was 34, not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street, but the kind of face that made you look twice, because something in it refused to apologize for existing. Her hair was dark and pulled back without ceremony. Her dress was clean but had been mended at the left sleeve twice. She was thin in the way that said she'd been feeding other people first. Behind her, 2 small faces appeared in the coach doorway. The older girl was maybe 9, with her mother's same dark hair and her mother's same watchful eyes. She climbed down carefully and immediately moved to stand beside Mara's left hip, close but not clinging, a child who had learned the difference. The younger one was 6, blonde, pale in a way that didn't match the woman she'd just climbed out beside. She hesitated at the coach door, looked at the drop to the ground, and then looked at Mara with an expression that was half question, half complete trust, and Mara reached up without a word and lifted her down. Roy Casper's eyes went straight to that second child. "Well," he said, not quietly, "there's already something wrong here." The woman at the dry goods counter, Ethel Marce, who had lived in Stone Ridge for 30 years and considered that tenure equivalent to a judicial appointment, stepped out from under the awning and looked Mara up and down with the efficiency of someone pricing livestock. "You're the one who answered the advertisement," she said. It wasn't a question. Mara met her eyes. "I am. 2 children." "Yes." "He advertised for a wife, not a family." The word family came out of Ethel's mouth like something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her boot, and Mara's jaw tightened, just a fraction, just enough that anyone paying attention would have seen it, but her voice stayed level. "I can read," Mara said. The advertisement didn't specify. Silas took 1 step forward, just 1, but it was enough. Ethel looked at him, read something in his expression that she clearly didn't like, and pressed her lips together. He looked at Mara. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was the kind of silence that has a whole conversation inside it. "I've got a wagon," he said finally. "It's a 2-hour ride." "I know," she said. "You mentioned that in the letter." He nodded. He reached down and picked up her leather bag, the one she hadn't waited for help with, and started toward the wagon without asking if that was all right. She watched him do it, and something in her face shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a door that had been latched for a very long time had just been tested from the other side. She followed him. The girls followed her. Behind them, Stone Ridge had opinions. 2 hours up that mountain with a stranger and 2 kids, Roy muttered to the man beside him. "He's out of his mind." "He's been out of his mind since Eleanor died," Ethel said, already moving back toward her store. "Now he's just making it everyone else's problem." Mara heard it. She had good ears, and she had spent years learning to hear things that were said slightly behind her. She didn't turn around. She kept walking. The younger girl, the blonde one, slipped her small hand into Mara's as they reached the wagon, and Mara's fingers closed around it automatically, the way you close your hand around something you're afraid of losing. The ride up the mountain was mostly quiet, which suited Silas fine and seemed to suit Mara even better. The older girl sat in the wagon bed and watched the landscape change from baked flatland to scrub pine to something that actually looked, if you squinted, like it might be beautiful in a year that had rain. The younger girl fell asleep against Mara's side within the first 20 minutes, and Mara sat with one hand braced against the wagon seat and the other keeping the child from sliding. After about 40 minutes of nothing but trail noise and the creak of the wheel that Silas had been meaning to fix since March, he said, "The advertisement was honest." "I know," she said. "It's a hard situation. The ranch is—" He stopped, started again. "It was doing better. Before. The word sat between them on the wagon seat with the particular weight that before always carries when someone doesn't explain it. "Your wife," she said, 2 years ago. She didn't say she was sorry. He noticed that. Most people said they were sorry, and he'd learned to nod at it the way you nod at weather, acknowledged, useless. She just looked at the road ahead. "I lost my husband 14 months ago," she said. "Fever. Quick. I'm sorry." She did the same thing he had, just nodded, looked at the road. "The girls," he said, careful. "Both yours?" The pause before she answered was short, barely anything, but it was there. "Clara is mine," she said, "the older one. Lily came to me after. Her people were gone." It was the kind of answer that answered the question and didn't answer it at all, and Silas had enough experience with people, with the particular way that certain people speak around certain things, to know not to push. He filed it away. Let the road take them forward. "I should tell you," he said, after another stretch of silence, "that I'm not an easy man to live with. I've been told that by several people who know me." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. "Was Eleanor one of them?" He glanced at her, surprised. "Yes," he said. "She was." What did she mean by it? He thought about that longer than she probably expected. "I work too much. I say less than I'm thinking. I have a temper that doesn't always come when I expect it, and sometimes doesn't come when it should." He paused. "I'm better with animals than I am with people." "That's honest," she said. "I said the advertisement was." She turned to look at him directly for the first time since the wagon had started moving. He had the feeling of being evaluated, not unkindly, but thoroughly. The way you look at a fence line to see where the weak posts are. "I work hard," she said. "I'm not good at asking for things. I have a temper too, but mine comes exactly when I expect it. Clara is old enough to pull her weight, and she will." "Lily," her voice changed on the child's name, just slightly. "Lily needs time. She's had a hard year." "How old?" 6. He nodded. "I should also tell you," Mara said, and here her voice dropped just enough that he had to lean slightly toward her to catch it, "that there are things about my situation that are complicated. I'm not hiding that from you. I will tell you when I know you better." "Fair enough," he said. She looked at him again, like she was waiting for him to push back, to demand more, to be the kind of man who decided what he was owed in information before he'd earned it. When he didn't, she turned back to the road, and this time the thing that moved across her face was closer to actual relief. The wheel creaked. The pine trees thickened. Up ahead, the ranch came into view. The main house with its faded gray paint, the barn that had seen better decades, the fencing that ran in straight, determined lines across the slope like Silas Boone had drawn them by force of will. Clara stood up in the wagon bed to see better. Lily stirred awake, lifted her head from Mara's side, and looked up at her. "Is this it?" the child whispered. Mara looked at the ranch, at the exhausted mountain land around it, at the sky above that was bright and completely, mercilessly cloudless. "This is it," she said. "Oh." She didn't sleep much the first night. The room he'd given her was clean. He'd made it clean, she could tell, recently. And there was a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar and careful storage. And she lay on top of it in the dark and listened to the specific silence of a mountain at night, which was different from every other silence she'd known. Clara was asleep in the cot against the far wall, face slack and young, in a way it rarely looked during the day. Clara had her mother's habit of carrying everything upright while she was awake. Lily slept between them, one hand fisted in the quilt, her breathing so quiet you had to watch her chest to be sure. Mara watched the ceiling. She had a document. She'd had it for 11 months. She'd carried it through 3 towns, 2 states, and 1 catastrophic night when she'd had to run with both children and leave almost everything else behind. It was sewn into the lining of her second-best travel bag, the one that looked like nothing, that she'd made certain to always carry herself, that she'd told Clara was just extra fabric. The document had names on it, dates, signatures and amounts and land survey numbers that told a story nobody in this territory was supposed to know. She had not intended to come this far north. She had not intended to answer a rancher's advertisement in a mountain settlement in the middle of a drought. She had intended, originally, to reach her cousin in Cheyenne. But the cousin had written back a letter that took 2 months to find her, and the letter said, "Don't come here. Harrow's men have been asking about you. I can't explain more. Don't come here and don't tell anyone I wrote." So she had stopped moving south and started moving north, and she had read the advertisement in a month-old newspaper in a boarding house in a town she didn't know, and she had thought, a ranch on a mountain, isolated, a man who needs something, a place where nobody would look. She had not expected the town to hate her before she stepped off the stage, but she had not been surprised by it either. What had surprised her was Silas, not the kindness specifically, though it was there, under the surface, like water under stone. What surprised her was the precision of his quiet, the way he seemed to understand without being told that she was not a woman to be handled, that she was there for reasons that went deeper than the advertisement, that she would tell him when she told him, and pressuring her would get him nothing. She had not met many men like that. She turned on her side to face the wall. The document stayed where it was, sewn into the bag, waiting, as it had been waiting for 11 months, patient as a held breath. Outside, a coyote called once from somewhere on the ridge, and then went quiet. The first week was an education for everyone involved, and not always a comfortable one. Silas ran his mornings in a specific order: coffee at 5, barn by 5:15, fence check by 6. And he ran them alone because that was how they had always gone. And the machinery of a person's morning is difficult to renegotiate. He came in for breakfast at 7:30 to find that Mara had made it, and it was better than what he made himself, and that was fine, but she'd moved his skillet to a different hook, and he spent 45 seconds looking for it before he found it. And something in his expression when he did told Clara, who was watching from the table, exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. "She does that," Clara told him. "She reorganizes things. She says she can't work in someone else's order." "This is my kitchen," Silas said. "I know," said Clara. "You could tell her that." He looked at the 9-year-old, who looked back at him with an expression of complete, unhelpful neutrality, and he sat down and ate his breakfast and did not say anything. And the next day the skillet was back on its original hook, and there was a second hook beside it where something of Mara's now hung, and that was apparently the negotiated settlement, and nobody discussed it further. By the end of the first week, he knew several things about Mara Whitlock. She worked without being watched and without announcing what she was doing, which meant you simply discovered it afterward. The mended bridle, the repatched section of roof over the small storage room, the systematic attack on the kitchen garden that had gone to drought-stressed ruin over the past 2 months. She worked until she was tired, and then she kept going, which was either admirable or alarming depending on your perspective, and Silas hadn't quite decided which yet. She was patient with Lily in a way that had no performance in it, no demonstration of patience, no visible effort, Just the steady presence of a person who understood that this particular child required time the way soil requires water, and that you couldn't rush either. She was less patient with Clara, which paradoxically seemed to be what Clara needed. "You used the same verb 3 times in one sentence," he heard her say one evening when Clara was reading aloud from the school primer. "That's lazy." "I'm tired," Clara said. "I know. Read it again." And Clara, grumbling in the particular key of a child who is annoyed but not actually arguing, read it again. He was sitting on the porch. He hadn't meant to listen, but the lamplight was coming through the window, and the voices were there in the evening air, and he sat with his coffee going cold and thought about Eleanor, who had wanted children and never had them, and about the way a house sounds different when there is life in multiple rooms of it simultaneously. It had been very quiet for 2 years. On the 9th day, he came home from the east fence line, the one that kept needing attention and kept getting it and kept needing it again in the particular cycle of maintenance that consumed about 30% of his waking hours, and found Mara standing absolutely still in the middle of the yard with her eyes fixed on the road at the bottom of the property. He followed her gaze. A rider. Sitting his horse at the property line, not coming forward, just sitting there. Too far to make out the face, but close enough to see the horse. Bay, well-fed, the kind of horse that costs more than most men in this valley made in a year. "You know that man?" Silas asked. Mara's voice came out flat and careful. "No." She was lying. He had spent enough time around people, around animals, which were better at honesty but taught you to read lies in the same motion, to know the difference. The rider sat there for another long moment. Then he turned the horse and rode back toward the road, easy and unhurried, the way a man moves when he wants you to understand that the leaving is his choice, not yours. Mara didn't move until the horse was out of sight. Then she let out a breath, and it was the kind of breath that tells you a person has been holding something in much longer than the duration of whatever just happened. She turned and walked back toward the house. "Mara," Silas said. She stopped. "I told you there were complicated things," she said, without turning around. "I'm not ready yet." He stood in the yard and watched her go inside, and he thought about the document she'd referenced in her 3rd letter, the one where she'd said, "I carry certain papers with me that require discretion, and I need a situation where I can maintain that discretion for some time." He'd taken it to mean she was dealing with a legal matter, something routine, inheritance maybe, or a prior claim on property. He was beginning to think it was not routine. He looked back at the road where the rider had been. The bay horse. The comfortable way the man had sat there, not announcing himself, not approaching, just looking. The specific posture of a man who was not asking permission. Silas knew that posture. He'd seen it before. He'd seen it on men who worked for Gideon Harrow. He put his hat back on, and he went to check the fence line, and he didn't say anything to Mara that evening, and she didn't say anything to him, and the lamp burned in the kitchen until very late, while the house was quiet around it. On the 11th day, Clara came to him. She found him in the barn, which was where she'd learned he went when he was thinking about something he wasn't saying out loud. He wasn't the only one who had been paying attention. She sat on the rail of the empty stall across from him, feet swinging, not pretending she'd come for any other reason. "She won't tell you herself," Clara said. "She thinks it puts you in danger." Silas kept working the leather strap he was repairing. "What does?" Clara was quiet for a minute. 9 years old, but she had the weight of someone who had been carrying grown-up information in a child-sized body for too long. "We knew Lily's family," she said, "before. Her father's name was Thomas Dunbar. He had land, good land, with a spring on it, the only spring for 20 miles in one direction." Silas's hands slowed. "Someone wanted that land," Clara said. "Someone with a lot of money and not a lot of—" She paused, searching for the word. "Patience for people who said no." "Dunbar said no," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Dunbar and his wife said no," Clara confirmed. "And then there was a fire." She said it the way children sometimes say terrible things, very simply, very directly, because they haven't yet learned to dress terrible things up in softer language. Mama was there. She was visiting. She got out with Lily because Lily was playing in the back field, and Mama grabbed her and ran. She stopped. Her feet had stopped swinging. She went back. For evidence. She's like that. Silas set down the leather strap. What she found, Clara said, is in her bag, the one she always carries herself. He looked at the child. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes, watchful, assessing, deciding whether the information had landed in safe hands. The man who wanted the spring, Silas said slowly. You know who he is? Clara nodded. Does your mother know he has land up here, that this is his territory? She found out after she wrote the letter, Clara said. She almost didn't come. She almost turned around. But she didn't. She didn't have anywhere else to go, Clara said. Simply. Truthfully. The way only children and very honest adults state the hardest facts. And she said, the girl stopped, looked at her swinging feet again. She said you sounded like someone who didn't give up easily. The barn was quiet around them. Outside, Lily could be heard talking to herself somewhere near the water trough, the running, made-up narrative of a child at play, the sound of a child who had been given enough safety to temporarily forget what safety costs. Silas sat with what Clara had told him and turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what's under it. Gideon Harrow. Because it was Harrow. It had to be Harrow, the only man in this valley who bought springs and bought land and bought people, and when they didn't sell, they simply stopped being problems by other means. Silas had known Harrow for 15 years, had watched him expand his empire acre by acre, deed by deed, some of them clean and some of them not, but always legal on paper because Harrow owned enough of the right paper. And now Mara Whitlock was sitting in his kitchen with evidence of Harrow's crimes sewn into her travel bag, and Harrow's rider had been at the property line 2 days ago, and Mara hadn't told him because she thought knowing would put him in danger, which, to be fair, it would. It already did. Clara, he said. Yes, sir? Does your mother know you came to tell me this? Clara looked at him with an expression that was very close to her mother's particular variety of not answering. I see, he said. He picked up the leather strap again. He worked it for a while. Clara stayed on the rail and let him. You should go find Lily, he said eventually. She's been talking to herself for 20 minutes, and she'll start talking to the chickens next, and then we'll never hear the end of it. Something in Clara's face, the careful, armored 9-year-old face, cracked open for just a second, and she almost smiled. Yes, sir, she said, and dropped off the rail and went. Silas sat in the barn and looked at his hands, which were steady, which surprised him a little. He thought, a spring, a document, a man who kills people for land. He thought, she came here with nothing and no options and 2 children and a secret that could get all of them killed. He thought, she was right. I don't give up easily. Outside, Lily's monologue shifted abruptly from make-believe to excited real world as Clara appeared, and the 2 children's voices rose together in the particular harmony of young people who have found each other and decided, without negotiation, that the world makes more sense in tandem. Silas listened to that sound for a minute. Then he put down the leather strap, stood up, and walked toward the house to have a conversation with Mara Whitlock that she had not yet decided to have with him. He found her in the kitchen, which was where she went when she was thinking about something she wasn't ready to say out loud. He'd learned that much in 11 days, the same way she'd learned he went to the barn. People settle into the geography of their habits faster than they realize, and a house will teach you a person if you pay attention. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, doing something with dried beans that didn't require the level of concentration she was giving it. Her hands were moving, her shoulders were tight. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. She didn't turn around. Clara talked to you, she said. It wasn't a question. She did. Mara set down the beans. She turned around, and her face had the look of a woman who had been bracing for this specific moment for a week and a half and still wasn't ready for it. She shouldn't have done that. She's 9 and she's scared, and she trusts you too much to tell you she's scared, Silas said. So she told me instead. That's not a flaw. That's a kid doing the best she can. Mara looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but reorganized, the way a face does when it stops preparing a defense and starts paying attention instead. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd been sitting in all week. This one had edges. Thomas Dunbar, she said finally. Yes. You know who killed him? I know who benefits from the way things are in this valley, Silas said. I've known it for years. I just didn't have a name to put on a piece of paper. She looked at him with an expression he would come to recognize over time as Mara's version of making a decision, a specific stillness that preceded action the way a held breath precedes a shout. "I have more than a name," she said. She got up. She went to the room where the girls slept. He heard the soft sound of a bag being moved, the particular quiet of hands doing something careful, and then she came back and set a folded document on the table between them. It was a land survey. Attached to it, 2 letters, not sealed, their wax broken long ago, and a ledger page that had been torn out with enough force that the edge was ragged. The handwriting on the ledger was precise and small and utterly damning. "Thomas kept records," Mara said. She sat back down. He was that kind of man. Meticulous. He kept everything, even the things people thought he'd signed away. She touched the corner of the survey without unfolding it. "This shows the Dunbar Spring, original deed, registered in Cheyenne in 1871. Thomas's father filed it. It's clean. No one else has a legal claim, no matter what the county records say now." "Harrow has the county records," Silas said. "Harrow has someone in the county clerk's office," she corrected. "That's what the ledger page shows. Payments. 8 of them over 4 years, all to the same initials. I know whose initials they are because Thomas told me, 2 weeks before the fire." He knew someone was coming for him. He knew. He tried to get ahead of it. Her voice thinned for a moment, and she stopped and breathed through it. He was too slow. Silas looked at the documents. He didn't touch them. "Why didn't you go to the marshal?" "The marshal in Carver County roadie for Harrow's brand for 6 years before he got the badge," she said flatly. "The next nearest federal authority is in Cheyenne, and getting to Cheyenne requires passing through 2 counties where Harrow's name opens doors and closes mouths." She paused. "I tried. 8 months ago. I got as far as the way station at Riley's Crossing before a man I'd never seen in my life told me, very politely, very quietly, while my children were 10 feet away, that it would be a shame if the road to Cheyenne proved difficult for a woman traveling alone." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He threatened you." "He made an observation," she said. "Harrow's people are always making observations." He looked up from the documents and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't let himself do since she arrived, because looking at a person that directly and that carefully is an act of commitment, and he hadn't been certain he was ready to commit. He saw the 11 months in her face, the weight of carrying something alone that was never meant to be carried alone, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been vigilant every waking hour for so long that they've forgotten what it felt like before. "The man at the property line 2 days ago," he said. "Harrow's," she said. "He knows you're here." "He knows a woman with 2 children came to Stone Ridge to answer an advertisement," she said. "Whether he's connected that to me yet, I don't know. He has reach, but he's not." She stopped. "He's not actually as smart as people think he is. He's just rich enough that smart has never been necessary. That's a dangerous thing to underestimate." "I'm not underestimating it. I'm explaining the difference." She folded her hands on the table. They were steady. He noticed that. "He's dangerous because of what he has, not because of what he is. That matters. It means he makes mistakes when his money doesn't fix the problem immediately." Silas thought about Gideon Harrow, his office in the big house on the ridge south of town, his 200 acres of prime valley land, the way men in Stone Ridge talked about him in a particular tone that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but was made of equal parts of both. He thought about the way Harrow had bought the Kellerman place 3 years ago, after old Pete Kellerman died and his son couldn't make the bank payment, and how the price Harrow paid had been exactly right, which is to say exactly wrong, enough to satisfy the debt, not a dollar more. Take it or leave the bank, take the property instead. He thought about Roy Casper at the feed store, who'd stopped carrying feed on credit the same year he started buying it exclusively through Harrow's supply chain. He thought about 11 families. He was thinking about that number specifically because it was the number he would learn later, but in that kitchen, in that moment, he was already thinking about how a man builds an empire in a valley, and it is never done cleanly, and the people who know that never seem to be the people with the power to stop it. "What do you need?" he said. Mara blinked. Like the question surprised her. Like she had been prepared for a different kind of conversation entirely. Argument, maybe, or fear, or the particular variety of masculine problem-solving that involves a man deciding what will happen next without consulting the person who has been managing the situation for 11 months. "I need time," she said, "and I need—" She stopped, started again. "There's a man, a witness. His name is Arlo Vance. He was Harrow's foreman for 3 years, and he was present for 2 of the land transfers that the ledger page documents. He left Harrow's employ about 18 months ago, which tells me something happened that made staying worse than leaving, and a man like that is either terrified or he's waiting for someone to give him a reason. Where is he?" "Last I heard, he was working a small outfit about 40 miles northeast, town called Birch Hollow." She paused. "Getting there without being followed is the problem." "I know a way up through the North Pass," he said. "Takes longer, but nobody uses it since the Harmon family sold their grazing rights. I've ridden it a dozen times." She looked at him steadily. "Silas, you understand what I'm asking you to be part of." "You didn't ask me," he said. "I'm telling you what I know." Something crossed her face that might, in another life, in a different year, have been the beginning of something warm. But she pressed it down because she was not a woman who let herself feel safe before she had reason to, and she had not yet had reason to. "The girls stay here," she said. "The girls stay here," he agreed. She nodded once, picked up the documents and held them for a moment, then set them back down in front of him. "You should know what you're holding." "I know what I'm holding." "Then you should know that Harrow will not ask questions before he acts. If he decides this ranch is a problem, he will make it a problem before we have a chance to respond." "I know that too." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the lamp on the table burned between them like a held opinion. "All right," she said. "Well, the days that followed had a particular texture, the feeling of 2 people building something while pretending, for the sake of everyone around them, that everything was normal. Silas worked the ranch, Mara worked the kitchen garden, and the storage situation, and the leaking section of the second-floor ceiling that had been leaking since winter, and that no one had gotten around to addressing, because getting around to things requires a person who isn't doing everything else first. Clara helped where she was asked, and sometimes where she wasn't, because she was that kind of child. Lily grew incrementally less watchful each day, which was the most hopeful thing Silas had seen in 2 years. He found himself watching Lily sometimes, not in a way that had anything sentimental in it. He wasn't built for sentimental, or he'd told himself that long enough that he believed it, but with a specific, careful attention. The child had seen her parents die. She was 6. She carried it the way children carry things that are too large for them, which is to say silently and at great cost, in a place you can't see unless you know to look. She had started talking to the horses. Silas let her. He showed her once how to stand so that a horse could smell her without feeling crowded, and she stood exactly the way he showed her without being asked twice. And the old mare that hadn't let anyone but Silas touch her face in 3 years lowered her head and pressed her nose into Lily's palm, and Lily looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and fierce protective joy. "She likes me," Lily said. "She doesn't like most people," Silas said. Lily looked back at the mare with an expression he recognized, because he had worn it himself. The expression of someone who has been told they are not liked by the world and has accepted it so thoroughly that any evidence to the contrary becomes a kind of miracle. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. It was 3 weeks after Mara's arrival, on a Thursday afternoon with a sky that had been building clouds since morning, like it was considering finally doing something about the drought, when Gideon Harrow rode up the road to the Boone Ranch. He didn't come with riders. That was the first thing Silas noted. Harrow came alone, which was either confidence or a very specific kind of message. He was 60, or close to it, with the kind of face that had started out handsome and been rearranged by decades of getting everything he wanted into something that merely looked powerful. He dressed well. He always dressed well. It was one of the things people mentioned about Harrow: the clothes, the horse, the way he moved through a space as though it had been prepared for him. Silas was at the fence near the road when Harrow came up, and he stood his ground, which was his property, and waited. "Boone," Harrow said in the tone of a man greeting an employee. "Harrow," said Silas, in the tone of a man who owns his own fence. Harrow looked at the house, the kitchen garden, which Mara had reclaimed enough that it was visibly alive again, the repaired section of barn roof, the small, particular signs of a place that had recently started being cared for again. I heard you took on a wife, Harrow said. Woman came to help run the place, Silas said. That's her business and mine. Woman with children. Her business and mine. Harrow smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that men like him develop because they've learned that it unsettles people more than hostility does. I'm just being neighborly, Silas. No reason to be unfriendly. No reason to be friendly either, Silas said. You've never ridden up to my fence to ask about my household before. Something I can do for you? Harrow let the smile sit a moment longer than was comfortable, then allowed it to leave. I had a hand go missing 18 months back. Vance, you know him? Arlo Vance, good man, reliable. He left without notice, which was unusual. He paused. I've been keeping an eye out. Can't help you, Silas said. The woman who came, Harrow said, casual, looking at the house again. Where'd she come from? Advertisement. Before that. That's not your business, Silas said. Harrow looked at him. The smile was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was assessment. The cold, calculating look of a man deciding whether a thing in his way is worth the cost of removing it, or whether there's a more efficient solution. The drought's been hard on everyone, Harrow said, still looking at the house. Ranches failing, people making desperate decisions, taking in strangers. He paused. I've been able to help a few families through it. Land purchases at fair prices, keeping things stable. He turned back to Silas. I have a standing offer on this property. You know that. If things get difficult, the offer stands. Things aren't difficult, Silas said. They can get that way fast, Harrow said pleasantly, and turned his horse and rode back down the road at an easy walk, unhurried, the way he'd arrived. Silas stood at his fence for a long time after Harrow disappeared around the first bend. Then he went inside and told Mara. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, He knows. He suspects, Silas said. There's a difference. Not much of one. She pressed her hands flat on the table, thinking. He came alone because he didn't want witnesses to what he was actually asking. He mentioned Vance to see if you'd react. She looked up. Did you react? No. Good. She was quiet again. Then, he's going to move faster now. The drought gives him cover. Any pressure he puts on this ranch looks like economics from the outside. Foreclosure, debt, hard times. Her voice was level, but her eyes weren't. He's done it before. I have 3 of those transactions in the ledger page. He can't foreclose on what I don't owe, Silas said. I own this place clear. He doesn't need a real debt, she said. He needs a claim that takes long enough to sort out legally that he can control the situation in the meantime. Silas sat down. What kind of claim? She looked at him with an expression that said she hadn't wanted to have this specific part of the conversation yet. Cattle, she said. It's always cattle out here. A theft accusation moves fast and it doesn't need much evidence and it takes the accused off the property while it gets sorted. She paused. He's going to need you gone long enough to search this house. The room held that information for a moment. He thinks the documents are here, Silas said. They are here, she said. They won't be, he said. She looked at him. There's a place up at the north tree line, he said. Dry rock overhang. I've used it for supply storage when the creek floods the lower barn. Nobody knows it's there. Eleanor didn't know, and she knew everything about this place. He paused. We moved the documents there tonight. And Lily, Mara said quietly. His eyes went to her face. If he searches this house and doesn't find the documents, the next thing he looks for is the Dunbar heir, she said. He knows she exists. He just doesn't know where she is yet. When he figures out she's here. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was completely flat, which was worse than if it had broken. He can't find her. He won't, Silas said. You can't promise that. No, he said, but I can make it as difficult as I can make it, and I can start tonight. She looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of a woman who has been taking care of everything alone for so long that the act of having someone say I can help requires almost as much trust as the help itself. Why are you doing this? She said. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. He thought about it honestly, which was his way. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, and because they're on my land, which makes it my business, and because... He stopped. looked at his hands on the table. Because I've watched Harrow take things from people in this valley for 15 years, and I never had a reason to stop watching. He looked up at her. Now I do. She held his gaze. He held hers. All right, she said for the second time since she'd arrived. But it sounded different this time. That night, after the girls were asleep, they moved the documents. It was a moonless night, which helped, and they went on foot because horses make noise and leave tracks. And Silas carried the oil lamp low with his hand half over the glass while Mara carried the bag. He took her up through the back pasture and along the tree line, and the ground was dry and hard underfoot, and she kept pace with him without complaint through terrain that was not easy in the dark. The overhang was where he'd said, a low shelf of granite above a narrow depression in the hillside, invisible from below and protected enough that the document wouldn't see moisture even if the rain that had been threatening all day finally came. He'd wrapped the papers in oilcloth 2 nights ago, the night after Harrow's rider had appeared at the property line, because some part of him had already been thinking about this. She watched him tuck the wrapped packet into the back of the depression, behind a flat stone that you'd have to know was movable. You prepared this already, she said. I thought about it. She was quiet a moment. The dark around them was the specific dark of high ground, with enough stars through a break in the clouds to give the shapes of trees their edges. You should know, she said, that if this goes wrong, the ranch could go with it. Harrow won't stop at running us off. He'll make sure there's nothing to come back to. I know that. I'm telling you because you should make the decision knowing it. Not just because it's the right thing, because it could cost you everything you've built. He looked at her in the dark. You made your decision knowing it. You made it 11 months ago, and you've been carrying it alone. She didn't answer that. You can't carry it alone anymore, he said. It's too much for one person. It was too much for one person before you walked into Stone Ridge. He paused. Let me carry some of it. The night was very quiet. A single cloud moved across the stars, and the hillside went darker, and then the cloud moved on. I'm not going to make this easy, she said. Her voice had something rough in it. I don't know how to do things the easy way. I'm not asking for easy, he said. I'm asking for honest. She turned away from the rock overhang and started back down the tree line, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked back down the hillside in the dark without touching, without talking, with the particular gravity of 2 people who have just decided something that neither of them has said out loud yet, and that was enough, for now. 2 days later, Roy Casper came to the ranch. He came on foot, which was unusual enough that Silas saw him from the upper pasture and came down to meet him before Roy reached the house. Roy was a big man, not quick in his movements, but he was moving now with something like urgency, his hat off and his forehead damp despite the dry air. Need to talk to you, Roy said when Silas was close enough. Talk. Roy looked at the house, at the barn, back at Silas. Not here. They walked down to the road, out of earshot of the kitchen window, and Roy put his hat back on and turned it in his hands. 3 of Harrow's men were in the feed store this morning, he said, asking about the woman. He glanced at Silas. Not subtle about it. One of them had a paper with a description. Silas kept his face still. What kind of description? Woman, mid-30s, dark hair, traveling with 2 children. One of the children, Roy stopped. One of the children described as small, fair-haired, approximately 6 years of age, notable for a small scar on the left wrist. He looked at Silas steadily. They had a name too, Dunbar. They were asking if anyone had seen a woman traveling with the Dunbar child. The scar on Lily's wrist. Silas had noticed it in the first week. A small thing, silvery. The kind of scar a child gets and you never ask because asking requires them to explain what caused it, and sometimes the explanation is one nobody should have to give. Harrow knew about the scar, which meant Harrow had someone who had seen Lily before the fire, before Mara, before everything. What did you tell them? Silas said. Roy looked at him, and for a moment the man who made it his business to know everything in town and broadcast it freely was very quiet and very still. I told them I didn't know anything about any children, Roy said, and I told them the feed store was closed for inventory. He paused. They left. Silas looked at Roy Casper, at the man he'd mostly dismissed for 15 years as a gossip and a noise, At the man who had stood at the water trough 2.5 weeks ago and watched Mara climb off the stagecoach with poorly concealed judgment, and he recalibrated. "Roy, I got kids of my own," Roy said, gruff, like he was apologizing for something. "And I've known for a long time that Harrow is not—" He stopped, put his hat on. "I've known for a long time, I just never—" He stopped again. His voice came out rough. "Never had a reason." They stood on the road and the words passed between them, and it was the same thing Silas had said to Mara 3 nights ago in the kitchen, the same admission that decent people make when they finally look at what they've been looking away from. "Go back to town," Silas said. "Don't say anything to anyone, not yet." "When?" Roy asked. "When I tell you," Silas said. "And Roy—" The other man looked at him. "Thank you." Roy Casper nodded once, put his head down, and walked back down the road toward Stone Ridge, and Silas turned and walked fast toward the house. Mara was in the kitchen. She read his face before he said a word, and she was already reaching for the back of her chair like she needed something solid to hold. "They have a description of Lily," he said. "Specific, including the scar." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "How long do we have?" she said. "I don't know. Days, maybe." She straightened, let go of the chair. The thing that moved across her face was not quite fear and not quite resolution. It was something between them, the particular expression of a person who has been afraid for a very long time and has run out of the luxury of sitting still inside that fear. "Then we need to move now," she said. "Vance," Silas said. "We go for Vance." "We go for Vance," she agreed. Outside, Clara was calling Lily in from the yard for supper, and Lily's voice came back high and clear across the dry air, and the sound of it was so ordinary and so fragile that Silas stopped for a moment and just listened to it. Because ordinary and fragile were the same thing sometimes, and you had to hear it clearly before you went out to protect it. They left before dawn. Silas had the horses ready by 4 in the morning, saddled quiet in the dark barn while the house still slept. And when Mara came out at 4:15, she was dressed for riding and carrying nothing extra, which told him she'd already thought through what mattered and what didn't. Clara was awake too. Mara had woken her, told her what she needed to know, and not a word more. Clara received the information the way she received most hard things, standing straight, asking one precise question. "How long?" she said. 3 days, Mara said. "Maybe 4. "And if something happens before you're back?" Mara looked at her daughter for a moment, 9 years old with the weight of everything in her face. "You go to Roy Casper in town, only Roy. You take Lily and you walk, don't ride, because riders get noticed. You tell Roy the name Arlo Vance and you say, 'The documents are safe. He'll know what to do.'" Clara repeated it back without being asked. Mara pulled her in and held her for 3 seconds, exactly 3, no more, and then let go. Lily was still asleep. Mara stood in the doorway of the room for a moment, looking at the small blonde shape in the cot, and then she turned away before it could cost her anything she couldn't afford to spend. Silas had packed water and dried meat and enough ammunition that Mara looked at the saddlebag and then looked at him. He said nothing. She said nothing. They rode out through the back pasture and up along the tree line the same way they'd gone 2 nights before, and the dark swallowed them before the first gray edge of dawn had touched the ridge. The North Pass route was not a trail in any official sense. It was a series of decisions. Go left at the 2-pine marker, follow the dry creek bed until it bends, take the higher ground when the rock shelf appears. Silas had ridden it enough times that his horse remembered it better than he did. They moved through the first hour in near total silence, the mountain breathing cold around them, and Mara matched his pace without being told and didn't ask about the turns. When the light came up enough to see properly, he looked at her once, and she was looking at the high ground ahead with an expression that was all forward momentum and nothing else. Her jaw was set. Her hands on the reins were steady. She was afraid. He knew she was afraid. He'd learned by now to see it in the particular stillness she deployed over it. But she was moving into the fear rather than away from it, which was the only kind of courage that actually meant anything. "Tell me about Vance," he said, when they'd cleared the first ridge and the going was easier. She thought for a moment. 35, maybe 40. Quiet man. He worked Harrow's operation from the inside, which means he saw how the land transfers happened. Not the paperwork side, Harrow kept that separate, but the practical side. The conversations, The pressure applied, the moment when a family that said no suddenly couldn't say anything anymore. She paused. He's not a good man. I'm not going to tell you he is. He stood by and let things happen because it paid him and because he told himself it wasn't his business. But he left. He left, she said, which means at some point it became his business and he couldn't unmake it. That kind of man is either carrying it like a stone or he's drunk himself to nothing. She looked at the trail ahead. I'm betting he's carrying it. Drunks don't hold their silence for 18 months. And you think he'll talk to you? I think he'll talk to someone who shows up with proof that someone else is already going forward, she said. A witness without evidence is a liability. Evidence without a witness is a document. Put them together and you have something a judge can't look away from. She glanced at him. I need him to understand he's not stepping into a hole alone. Silas turned that over. You've thought about this a long time. 11 months, she said. I've had time. They rode without talking for a while, and the mountain opened around them into a high meadow that was brown with drought, but still had the bones of what it would be in a wet year. And somewhere in the tree line on the far side, a hawk was working a thermal that didn't exist yet, just making practice passes against the gray morning sky. I should tell you something, Mara said. He waited. When I first wrote to you, she stopped, started again. The advertisement. I answered it because I needed to disappear into a situation that looked ordinary. A wife on a ranch in the mountains. Nothing notable. I want you to know that because it's not a comfortable thing to say, and I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because you deserve to know what you started with. He was quiet for a moment. The horse. I know, he said. She looked at him. I'm not naive, he said. You came with purpose, and it wasn't romantic, and I understood that. Eleanor used to say I was better at reading situations than people, and she wasn't wrong. He shifted in the saddle. I also know that some things start one way and become something else. That doesn't mean the start was dishonest. It means things change. She kept looking at him long enough that her horse drifted slightly left, and she corrected it without looking down. You're a strange man, she said. I've been told, he said. Birch Hollow was smaller than Stone Ridge and looked like it had stopped caring about itself sometime around 1874. The main street was 3 buildings on one side and 2 on the other, and a gap where a 4th had apparently burned down and nobody had filled it yet. There was a livery, a general store, a saloon that was doing better than everything else on the street, and a house at the far end that was the kind of gray that happens when paint gives up, Silas asked at the livery. The man there looked at them both with the specific disinterest of a person who has learned that strangers asking questions are almost never followed by anything good, and said he didn't know any Vance. Mara asked the woman at the general store. The woman said there was a hand working out at the Cali outfit, 3 miles east, who she thought might be the man they were looking for. 3 miles east, they found a small cattle operation that had maybe 60 head and a fence line that was fighting a losing battle, and a man mending it who looked up when they rode in and didn't run, which Silas took as a good sign but didn't relax either, which he took as a better one. Arlo Vance was closer to 45 than 40, with a face that showed years in the kind of arithmetic that outdoor work and bad decisions write on a person. He had good hands, working hands, the kind that knew what they were doing, and eyes that assessed Silas and Mara and the horses and the road they'd come from before he said a single word. You're not from here, he said. Not unfriendly, just accurate. No, Mara said. She dismounted and let the horse stand and walked toward him in a straight line, no hesitation, and stopped about 8 feet away. My name is Mara Whitlock. I knew Thomas Dunbar. Something happened in Vance's face. It was fast, and he covered it fast, but it happened, a flinch that wasn't physical, the kind that lives behind the eyes. I don't know that name, he said. You do, she said. You were at the meeting in Carver County in March of 1878 when Harrow's man made Dunbar the last offer on the Spring property. You were standing behind him. There were 4 other men present. I have the ledger page that documents the payment made to the county clerk the following week. She paused. I'm not here to hand you to anyone. I'm here because what I have is almost enough. Almost. Vance looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Silas, still mounted. Who's he? He's with me, Mara said. That covers a lot of ground, Vance said. His name is Silas Boone. He has land north of Stone Ridge. Harrow wants it. Vance's expression shifted slightly. He turned back to Mara. You're staying at Boone's place. Yes. Then Harrow already knows where you are, Vance said, and the flatness in his voice was not cruelty. It was the sound of a man stating physics, the way things fall, the way water moves downhill. He knows a woman with children came to Stone Ridge, Mara said. He's working on the rest. We have a few days, maybe less. Vance set down the fencing tool he was holding. He looked at his hands, then at the fence line, then at the cattle moving slow in the brown grass beyond it. I left that outfit, he said. I made my decision. I walked away. I know. Walking away was that was what I could do. His voice went rough. That family, the Dunbars. I didn't. He stopped. His jaw worked. I didn't know what was going to happen. I want you to understand that. I didn't know. I believe you, Mara said. He looked up at her sharply, like he expected the opposite. I believe you didn't know, she said. I also believe that you know now, and you've been carrying it for 18 months. And a man who carries something that long either puts it down or it puts him down. She kept her voice even. Not unkind, but not soft either, because soft would have been condescension, and she knew it. Thomas Dunbar kept records. I have them. I have the land survey, the ledger page, and 2 letters. What I don't have is a living person who was in that room. Vance was quiet. There was a child, Mara said. A little girl. She's 6 years old. She's living on Silas Boone's ranch. And she doesn't have a name anymore because the only name she had burned with her family, and if Harrow finds her before we move on this, she will disappear and nobody will know where she went. She stopped. Let that sit. I'm not telling you that to manipulate you. I'm telling you because you said you didn't know what was going to happen. I need you to know what will happen. The land was very quiet around them. The cattle moved. The fence creaked in a slight wind off the ridge. Arlo Vance looked at the ground for a long time. Then he said, What do you need me to say? They spent 4 hours with him. He talked, and Silas wrote it down in the small notebook he carried in his chest pocket. Dates, names, specific amounts. The precise language that had been used in that room in March of 1878. The name of the man who had delivered the message that Dunbar's refusal would not be tolerated. That name was a man named Cleet Briggs, who was Harrow's operations man, who had been the right hand on every one of these land acquisitions, and who was still in Harrow's employ, and who could, if Vance's testimony lined up with the ledger page, be connected to every transaction on that list. Vance wrote a statement. His handwriting was slow and careful, the handwriting of a man who didn't do it often, but understood when it mattered. He signed it. He dated it. He looked at Mara when he was done. What do I do now? Can you get to Cheyenne? I can. The Federal Land Office, she said. There's a man named Aldous Pruitt. He's been in the same position for 12 years and he's not Harrow's man. Harrow tried to buy him in 1876 and he wouldn't move. He's the only federal authority in reach who I'm certain is clean. She paused. Tell him Mara Whitlock sent you. Tell him you have a statement regarding the Dunbar land claim and you're prepared to testify. He'll know what to do with it. And you? I'm going back, she said. Vance looked at her for a moment. He stopped. That's not the careful choice. No, she agreed. But I have 2 children on that ranch, and I'm not running again. He nodded slowly, looked at Silas. You're going back with her. I live there, Silas said. Vance almost smiled at that. Almost. All right, he said. He folded the copy of his statement and put it in his coat. I'll leave tomorrow morning. Tonight, Mara said. He looked at her. Tonight, she said again, please. Something in the word. Or maybe in the face of the woman saying it, or maybe just in the 18 months of weight he'd been carrying, made Vance nod. Tonight, he said, Welcome. They rode back hard and made the North Pass by last light, and came down the mountain in the early dark, and the ranch house had its lamp burning in the kitchen window, which Silas had told Clara to keep burning, and the sight of it did something to him that he didn't have language for and didn't try to name. They were 50 yards from the house when Mara's horse went wrong. Not lame. Something else. The horse pulled left and stopped and threw its head, and Mara steadied it automatically, but her eyes went to the barn. And Silas's eyes went to the barn at the same moment, because that was what the horse was reacting to, and what was wrong about the barn was the door. He'd latched that door. He always latched it. It was standing open 2 inches. He put his hand on her arm. She stopped. They sat on the horses in the dark and listened, and the ranch was quiet in the wrong way. The way where the sounds that are normally there have been displaced by the presence of something that doesn't belong. "Clara," she said, barely audible. He was already off his horse. She was off hers a second later, and they crossed the last distance to the house at a run that they both knew to make quiet. And Mara went through the back door first because Silas let her, because it was her children in there, and he understood without being told that no reasonable argument would have moved her aside. The kitchen was empty. The lamp was burning. There was a half-eaten supper on the table, 2 plates, abandoned mid-meal, which meant something had interrupted, which meant, "Up here," Clara's voice. From the top of the stairs, strained and deliberate, the particular voice of a child trying to sound calm because she's understood that calm is what's needed. They went up. Clara was in the doorway of the small room, standing with her back against the frame, and her face, when she saw Mara, went through relief and fear and something close to rage in about 2 seconds, and then locked back into careful. "2 men came," she said, "about an hour after dark. They didn't knock, they just—" She stopped. "I got Lily under the bed, the way you showed me." Mara crossed to her and put both hands on her face. "You're not hurt." "No, they didn't come inside. They looked in the windows." Clara's voice was very steady. "I stayed in the dark, and I kept Lily quiet." She paused. "They were in the barn for a while. I heard them." Silas went back down and crossed the yard to the barn. They'd gone through it methodically, not ransacked, not destroyed, but searched in the way that professionals search, which is to say thoroughly and with minimum evidence of having been there. A crate shifted. The loose board at the back wall tested. The tack room disturbed and mostly restored. They hadn't found anything, because there was nothing to find. But they'd been here, which meant the days Mara had estimated were already gone. He went back to the house. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table now, with Lily in her lap. Lily had come out from wherever she'd been once Mara appeared, pressing herself against Mara's side with the silent ferocity of a child who has learned that the people you love can disappear and is making absolutely certain this one doesn't. Mara had one arm around her and was looking at Silas over the top of the blonde head with an expression that said, I know what this means." "We can't wait for Vance to reach Cheyenne," she said. "They'll be back tomorrow with something legal. Cattle theft, false deed claim, whatever Harrow's decided to use." She looked at her hands. "If they come with a deputy and a court order, you lose the ranch before anything can be contested. And Lily—" "I know," he said. "We have to go public," she said. "Today. Tonight." He looked at her. "You want to make the accusation before he makes his move." "It's the only thing that changes the equation," she said. "If we wait for Vance in the federal office, Harrow controls everything that happens in between. But if we make the accusation publicly, in town, in front of witnesses, with documents in hand, then moving against us becomes visible. He can't quietly disappear a public accusation." "He can try," Silas said. "He can try," she agreed. "But trying looks like guilt." He sat down at the table. Lily had fallen asleep against Mara with the abrupt totality that small children achieve, out like a lamp, still holding a fistful of Mara's sleeve. Clara was looking at him, waiting to see what he did with what Mara had just said. 9 years old, doing the calculation, storing the result. "There's a meeting," he said slowly. "Thursday nights at the Grange Hall. Been going since the drought started. Water rights, feed costs, people trying to figure out how to stay afloat." He paused. "Tomorrow is Thursday." "How many people?" Mara said. 20, 30. It changes. Most of the ranching families in the valley have sent someone at least once." "Harrow?" "Harrow doesn't attend," Silas said. "He sends Briggs sometimes, to listen." She looked at him sharply. "Cleet Briggs." Cleet Briggs. The name landed between them with everything it carried. The name from Vance's statement, the name from the meetings, the name attached to every transaction on the ledger page like a signature on a bill of sale for things that weren't for sale. "If Briggs is there," she said carefully, "then there's a witness to the accusation who can't claim he didn't hear it," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through, checking it from different angles, looking for the holes. He watched her do it and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not admiration exactly, because admiration was too clean, but something close to it with rougher edges. The recognition of a mind that moved the way his moved, just faster. "It's not safe," she said finally. "No," he said. "If Harrow decides to act before the federal office has Vance's statement, he might," Silas said, "but he can't act against 30 witnesses. He can act against 2 people and 2 children driving back from a meeting in the dark." Silas looked at her steadily. "Roy Casper will be there. I'll ask him to bring men back with us." "You trust him that far?" "He came to my fence to warn us," Silas said, "and he's been watching Harrow take things from people he knows for 15 years. I think he's been waiting for someone to give him a reason, same as me." She looked down at Lily, asleep against her, at the small hand knotted in her sleeve, at the scar on the narrow wrist that Harrow's men had on a piece of paper somewhere. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly. "It might go wrong," he said. "I'm not going to tell you it won't." She looked up at him. "But staying here goes wrong too," he said. "There isn't a safe road, there's just the road." Clara was still watching him, and something in the girl's face, something around the eyes, in the set of the jaw, was so much her mother that it almost stopped him. He turned back to Mara. "What do you want to do?" She sat with it for a long moment. The lamp burned. The house was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place that doesn't know yet what tomorrow is going to ask of it. "We go to the meeting," she said. They arrived at the Grange Hall the next evening with 20 minutes to spare before the meeting opened, and they did not arrive quietly. Silas drove the wagon. Mara sat beside him with the documents and a leather satchel on her lap, and Clara sat behind them in the wagon bed with Lily pressed against her side, and the whole arrangement was as visible as Silas could make it. No back roads, straight down Main Street, at the hour when most people in Stone Ridge were either heading to the meeting or standing on their porches looking at who was heading to the meeting. Ethel Marsh was on her porch. She looked at Mara the way she had on the first day, and Mara looked back at her without expression, and the wagon rolled past. Roy Casper met them at the hall door. He had 2 men with him, his brother-in-law and Pete Foreman, who ran the largest independent cattle operation in the North Valley, and had been complaining about Harrow's water access interference for 2 years. Roy looked at Silas, and then at Mara, and then at the satchel, and then back at Silas. "You sure about this?" he said low. "Not even slightly," Silas said. "But we're doing it." Roy nodded. "Let them through." The hall was fuller than Silas had expected, 32 people by the time the meeting opened, because word had apparently moved through the valley in the particular fast way that word moves in small communities when something in the air suggests that tonight might be different from the other nights. Silas recognized most of the faces. Farmers, ranchers, a couple of the town's tradespeople, the school teacher who was also the unofficial record keeper for the valley's civic proceedings. And in the back corner, as Silas had half hoped and half dreaded, Cleet Briggs, sitting with his hat on and his arms crossed and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a man who is there to observe. The meeting chair, an older man named Harlan Deeds, called for order, and the water rights discussion that had been ongoing for 3 weeks started back up, and Silas sat through 7 minutes of it with his hands in his lap before he stood up. Harlan looked at him. The room looked at him. "I need the floor," Silas said. "We're in the middle of—" "I know," Silas said. "I need the floor." The room went quiet. There was something in his voice, not loud, not theatrical, just the specific weight of a man who has decided to say the thing and is going to say it regardless of what happens next. That stopped the argument before it started. Harlan sat down. Silas looked at the room, at the faces he'd known for 15 years, at Roy in the near corner, at Briggs in the back, at Mara, who was sitting with the satchel across her knees and her eyes on him with an expression that was not support exactly, but something more useful. The expression of a person who knows what they're about to do, who has checked every exit and accounted for every risk, and who has chosen this door anyway. "Most of you know Gideon Harrow," Silas said. "Most of you have done business with him or had reason not to. Most of you know that the last decade in this valley has moved in one direction, and that direction benefits one man." He paused. "What most of you don't know is how it happened. I have here documents that show how it happened. Land surveys, financial records, and a signed statement from a former Harrow employee who was present at coerced land transfers going back to 1876. He held up the satchel. "I'm making these available to anyone who wants to see them, tonight, in this room, in front of witnesses." The room erupted. Not in the way rooms erupt in stories, not cleanly, not in a single direction. It erupted the way real rooms erupt when real people are shocked. Multiple conversations at once. Someone saying that's a serious accusation. Someone else saying I always said it, I always said it. Harlan Deeds standing back up and calling for order that nobody was ready to give him yet. And in the back corner, Cleet Briggs stood up. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, and he moved through the room in the direction of the door with the measured pace of someone who is not fleeing but is absolutely leaving. And every person he passed either moved aside or turned to watch him, and by the time he reached the door, the room had largely gone quiet again, just from the watching. He stopped at the door, looked back at Silas. "You're making a mistake," he said. Not loud. Aimed. "I've made several," Silas said. Staying quiet this long was the biggest. Briggs looked at Mara. Something in his look, the specific calculation in it, the assessment, made the hair on the back of Silas's neck move. Then Briggs walked out the door, and it swung shut behind him. The room held its breath for a moment. Then Pete Foreman, in the fourth row, said, "Show us what you've got." And Mara opened the satchel. The ride home that night had 6 wagons in it. Roy Casper had organized it without being asked, in the quiet, efficient way he organized everything at the feed store. A fact, a need, a practical response. Pete Foreman rode directly alongside Silas's wagon. 2 other ranchers brought up the rear. They rode in without talking much, watching the dark on both sides of the road, and the night stayed quiet. It stayed quiet all the way up the mountain. It stayed quiet when they reached the ranch, and Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, and the other wagon stopped around it, and everyone listened for 30 seconds to the dark. Nothing. Just the mountain. Lily was asleep across Clara's lap, and Clara helped transfer her without waking her, and then looked at the ring of wagons and the men sitting them with their rifles across their knees, and turned to Silas. "Did it work?" she said. He thought about Briggs leaving, about the room that had stayed, all 32 people, looking at Mara's documents, asking questions, some of them with recognition in their faces that said they were seeing the shape of something they'd felt but never been able to name. He thought about the school teacher carefully copying the key figures from the ledger page into her own record book, slowly and precisely, making a duplicate that would exist outside of Harrow's reach. He thought about whether that was enough. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know, and he was not a man who pretended certainty he didn't have. "We made it visible," he said to Clara. "That's what we could do tonight." Clara processed that, nodded once. Mara was standing a few feet away, looking out at the darkness beyond the ranch, and he went and stood beside her, and she didn't move away. "Briggs is going to Harrow right now," she said. "Yes. We'll see what comes in the morning." "We will," he said. She turned and looked at him in the dark, and whatever she was going to say, she seemed to decide against saying it, and came down on something simpler instead. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. At the woman who had walked off a stagecoach 27 days ago with a secret and 2 children and not a single card in her hand that wasn't also a liability. At the woman who had mended his bridles and reorganized his kitchen and told him truth when she could and held back what she couldn't until she could manage it, and who had sat in a room full of strangers tonight and opened a satchel and said, "Here is what I know, and here is what I can prove, and here is what it cost." "Don't thank me," he said. "We're not done yet." She looked at him another moment. Then she turned back toward the house and the lamp burning in the window, and she walked toward it, and the door opened, and the light fell out across the dry ground in a long yellow line. And then the door closed, and the night was quiet again. Silas stood in the yard with Roy Casper and Pete Foreman and the darkness beyond the ranch, and whatever was coming from Harrow's direction, it was coming in the morning. Harrow came at 9 in the morning. Not alone this time. He came with Cleet Briggs and 2 deputies from Carver County, men with badges that were legal enough on paper, the kind of legal that Harrow had been manufacturing for years through the right payments to the right people. He came with a court order, which was a single page with the judge's signature at the bottom, and the judge's name was a man named Corrigan, who had ruled in Harrow's favor on 5 land disputes in 4 years, and who nobody in the valley had ever seen rule against him on anything. Silas saw them coming from the upper pasture. He had been up since 5, the same as every morning, but he had not gone far from the house, and Roy Casper's brother-in-law had slept in the barn and was still there. And Pete Foreman had sent his eldest son back up at first light to sit the ridge road with a clear view of the approach. The boy had come down at 8:45 and said simply, 4 riders, Harrow and Briggs, and 2 badges. So they were ready, or as ready as you can be for something like that, which is to say, ready in the body and not quite ready in the stomach. Mara was in the kitchen when Silas came inside to tell her. She was standing at the counter with a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from, and when he told her, she set it down and straightened up, and her face did the thing it did, the reassembling, the deliberate closing of the doors on whatever was happening behind them. The documents, she said, still at the overhang. The copies the school teacher made, I sent word to her this morning through Roy, he said. She's already made a second copy. Roy has 1 set. She's keeping one. Mara nodded slowly. All right. They have a court order, he said. It's going to look like cattle theft. Cattle went missing from the Henderson place 2 weeks ago. I heard about it at the time, but didn't think anything of it. Harrow's been setting this up since before we went to the Grange. Something moved through her face. Not surprise. She had already figured this out, or something close to it. More like the particular weariness of having been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. They'll take you in, she said. That's the point. Get you off the property long enough to— I know, he said. She looked at him. Don't fight it. He looked back at her. Don't fight the deputies, she said. If you fight it, they have grounds for more. Let them serve the order. Roy and Pete are witnesses. It stays visible. She said it the way she said most hard things, straight and quick, like pulling something out before it could close over. Visible is the only thing that's keeping us safe right now. He hated it. She could see that he hated it, and she didn't soften it for him, because softening it wouldn't change what was true. And you? He said. I stay with the girls. Roy's brother-in-law stays in the barn. She picked up the coffee cup again, more to have something in her hands than because she wanted it. Harrow won't move against me while there are witnesses, and while the accusation is already public. He'll move through legal channels first because that's what he does. He uses the legal system as a weapon, and he's very good at it. She paused. But he's never had to use it against someone who had the documentation to fight back. The sound of horses on the road reached them then, and they both went still for a moment, listening to it, and then Silas put on his hat and walked out the front door. Harrow pulled up in the yard with the 2 deputies flanking him, Briggs slightly behind, the whole arrangement as composed and deliberate as a painting that had been planned in advance. Harrow's horse was the same bay as always, well-fed and expensive, and Harrow himself looked like a man who had slept perfectly well the night before, which was either true or the best performance of Silas's life to witness. Boone, he said. Harrow. One of the deputies, a heavy-set man with a badge pinned slightly crooked to his coat, which for some reason was the detail Silas's mind fixed on, produced the court order and held it out. Silas took it, read it. It said what he expected. Cattle theft, 11 head, property of Gerald Henderson, last seen on a property line adjacent to the Boone Ranch, warrant for detention pending investigation. The judge's signature was neat and confident at the bottom. This is manufactured, Silas said. That's for the court to determine, the deputy said, in the tone of a man reciting something he'd been told to say. I understand that, Silas said. He folded the order and put it in his coat pocket. I'll come peacefully. I want it noted by everyone present that I'm coming peacefully and that I dispute this order. Roy Casper, who had materialized from the side of the barn with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular expression of a man who is very angry and being very deliberate about it, said, noted, witnessed. Pete Foreman's son, from near the fence, said, witnessed. Harrow looked at Roy with an expression that was not quite what Silas expected. Not annoyance, not anger, but something colder, more evaluating, like he was updating a list. Mara came out of the house. She stood on the porch and looked at Harrow, and Harrow looked at her, and it was the first time they had been in the same space and acknowledged it, and the air between them had the particular charge of 2 people who have known each other through intermediaries and finally found themselves in the same room, except there was no room. Just the open yard and the dry mountain air and everything that had happened between them without them ever meeting. Mrs. Whitlock, Harrow said, like he was greeting her at a social occasion. She said nothing. I don't have a quarrel with you, he said. Whatever you believe, I want you to know that. She looked at him for a long moment. You should be more concerned with what I can prove than with what I believe, she said. Something in his face, very small, very quick, shifted, and then it was gone, and the composed, reasonable face was back, and he nodded at the deputy. Silas let them put him on a horse. He didn't look back at the ranch as they rode down the mountain, because looking back was not something he could afford to do right now and stay in the frame of mind that was required. He looked at the road ahead, and he thought about the copies of the documents spread across 3 different hands, and about Arlo Vance somewhere between Birch Hollow and Cheyenne, and about the 32 people who had been in that Grange Hall last night and who could not now unknow what they knew. He thought, "Visible is the only thing keeping us safe." He told himself he believed it. The jail in Carver County was a single-room building behind the marshal's office, and the marshal was a man named Tilson, whose history with Harrow's operation Mara had mentioned in the kitchen 10 days ago. Tilson booked him with the efficiency of a man who has done a distasteful thing enough times that it no longer reads as distasteful, just procedural. "You'll have a hearing," Tilson said. 3 days. 3 days is a long time, Silas said. "It's the schedule," Tilson said, and that was all he had to say about it. The cell had a cot and a window that looked at the back wall of the building next door, which was the back of the feed store, and Silas sat on the cot and looked at that wall and thought carefully through what 3 days meant for the people he'd left on the mountain. He thought about it until late afternoon, and then Roy Casper appeared at the window. Not the jail window, the other one, the small high window in the back wall that faced an alley, and pressed his face close to the bars. "You all right?" Roy said. "I'm in jail," Silas said. "I know where you are. I asked if you're all right." "I'm fine. How is—" "They're fine," Roy said quickly, reading the question before it was finished. "My brother-in-law and Pete's son are both there. Harrow hasn't moved on the property. He's waiting for something." "He's waiting to see if Vance surfaces," Silas said. "If the federal office gets involved, the cattle charge becomes irrelevant. He can't use a county warrant to block a federal land investigation. But if Vance doesn't make it to Cheyenne, then you sit here 3 days and they find some way to extend it," Roy said grimly. "And while you're sitting here, the pressure on the ranch builds until something gives." "Yes." Roy was quiet for a moment. "The people from the meeting last night," he said, "some of them have been talking today. Pete talked to the Kellerman boy, not the old man's son, the grandson, the one who was 15 when Pete sold the place. He's been in Cheyenne for 3 years, and he knows someone at the land office." He stopped. "I'm not saying it's the same man Mara knows, but it might be." Silas looked at the wall. "Get that to Mara. Today." "I'm going up after this," Roy said. "Tell her about the Kellerman connection. Tell her—" He stopped. Started again. "Tell her to trust her own judgment. She knows what to do." Roy looked at him through the bars for a moment, and there was something in his expression that Silas chose not to examine too closely, because it was the look a person gets when they see something they weren't expecting to see, something that surprises them about someone they thought they already knew. "You're not what I thought you were, Boone," Roy said. "What did you think I was?" "A man who kept to himself and didn't cause trouble." "I kept to myself," Silas said. "The trouble found me." Roy almost smiled. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, and disappeared from the window. On the mountain, Mara was not waiting. She had thought, in the first hour after Silas was taken, about waiting. She had considered it seriously and practically, turned it over, looked at its logic, and then set it aside because waiting was the strategy that relied on other people's timelines, and she had spent 11 months being shaped by other people's timelines, and it had nearly destroyed all 3 of them. What she did instead was this. She sat at the kitchen table with the 2 girls, and she said, very clearly and without drama, that things were going to move fast in the next few days, and she needed them both to be honest with her about what they were afraid of. Clara said, "I'm afraid Silas won't come back." Lily said nothing. She was looking at the table. Then she said very quietly, "I'm afraid it's like before." Mara looked at her. At the small face, the scar on the wrist, the 6 years of weight in the eyes. "Like before," she said. "You mean when you lost your family?" Lily nodded, still looking at the table. "That is not what's happening," Mara said. Not gentle soft, but clear firm, the kind of voice that a frightened child can actually hold on to. "I know it feels the same. I know it started the same way, and I understand why your body thinks it knows what comes next. But I'm telling you, Silas is coming back. Roy is watching over him, and we are not running." Lily looked up. "We're not running?" "We are not running," Mara said. "Not this time." Something in the child's face shifted. Not relief. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. The beginning of a question that might eventually become something like trust. Roy came in the late afternoon and told her about the Kellerman connection, and Mara listened to all of it and then asked two precise questions, and then she asked Roy to send word to the Kellerman grandson in Cheyenne, not just to the land office, but specifically to him, with a message that was short enough to travel fast and specific enough to matter, documents in hand, witness en route. Boone Ranch, Stone Ridge, time is short. And if the grandson doesn't know Pruitt, Roy asked, then we've lost nothing, she said. But in my experience, people who have lost land to Harrow tend to know the one federal official Harrow hasn't managed to buy. They look for him the way you look for water in a drought. Roy looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a long time. Since the night of the fire, she said. 11 months is a long time to think. He left. Mara went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and looked at the lamp and breathed. 3 days. Silas had 3 days before the hearing, and if nothing changed by the hearing, Harrow's manufactured charge would give the county system enough room to extend the detention, and extended detention meant pressure on the ranch and pressure on the documents and pressure on Lily, and pressure applied in enough directions at once had a way of finding the crack that nobody knew was there. She needed Vance in Cheyenne. She needed Pruitt to move. She needed the Kellerman grandson to be exactly what Roy said he was. She needed 3 things to happen independently on the right timeline, and she had influence over none of them directly. And that was the specific kind of helplessness that was hardest to sit with. Not the helplessness of having nothing, but the helplessness of having done everything you can do and now being required to wait for the world to catch up. She was not good at that kind. She was not going to pretend otherwise. The second day was the hardest. Nothing happened, which was its own kind of event. No word from Cheyenne. No word from Vance. The ranch sat on the mountain with its guards and its lamp and its 2 children and the particular silence of a place braced for something that hadn't come yet, which is always worse than the thing itself. In the afternoon, Ethel Marce came up the road. Mara saw her from the kitchen window and felt something move through her chest that was not quite hostility and not quite wariness, but was made of memories of being looked at and found lacking before she'd said a word. She went to the door and opened it before Ethel could knock. Ethel was carrying something, a covered dish. She stood on the porch step with it and looked at Mara, and Mara looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. I heard about Silas, Ethel said. Everyone's heard, Mara said. Yes. Ethel looked at the dish. I made a stew for the girls. She paused. And for you. Mara looked at her. She was trying to find the angle, the strategy behind it, the thing Ethel wanted. Because in her experience, people didn't arrive with covered dishes out of pure impulse. And then she looked at Ethel's face, at the 60-odd years in it, at the expression that was not comfortable and wasn't trying to be, that had the look of someone doing something they'd decided to do and weren't certain was welcome and were doing it anyway. She stepped back from the door. Ethel came in. She set the dish on the counter. She looked at the kitchen, at the second hook beside Silas's hook, at the repaired ceiling section, at Clara's primer on the table and the way the kitchen garden was visible through the back window, alive and deliberate in the drought. You've done a lot here, Ethel said. It needed doing, Mara said. Ethel turned and looked at her directly, and Mara held the look. And they were 2 women in a kitchen holding a moment that had the weight of everything that had been said and not said since that first morning at the stagecoach. I was unkind, Ethel said. When you arrived. You were. I've been unkind to several people over the years, Ethel said, for reasons that had more to do with fear than with sense. She stopped. The things Silas said at the meeting, the documents. Harrow has land on every side of mine. Her voice was flat. I've known for years that something was wrong. I chose to believe it didn't concern me. Mara said nothing. Let it sit there. It concerns me, Ethel said. It concerns all of us. I understand that now. She looked at the covered dish. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But it's what I have. Mara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the cost of pride. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that makes speeches, but the daily grinding kind that makes a person stand at a stagecoach and look at a woman and decide she is a problem before she's had the chance to be a person. She thought about how much energy that cost and how little it built, and how the drought had stripped away enough that even Ethel Mars was left with nothing to hide behind. "Thank you," Mara said. "The girls will be glad for it." Ethel nodded once and left, and Mara stood in the kitchen and looked at the covered dish for a while. Clara, from the doorway of the back room. "What was that?" "Someone changing their mind," Mara said. "Well, word came on the third day, and it came from an unexpected direction. It was mid-morning, and Mara was in the kitchen garden doing the work that needed doing regardless of what else was happening. Because gardens do not wait for crises to resolve when a rider came up the road. Not from town, from the north, which was unusual because the north road came from Cheyenne. The rider was young, 20 maybe. He had a sealed letter in his coat, and he asked for Mara Whitlock by name. And when she came to the fence, he handed her the letter and said, "From Aldous Pruitt, Federal Land Office, Cheyenne." She held the letter without opening it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened it. Pruitt's handwriting was the handwriting of a man who took written communication seriously, clear, deliberate, without flourish. The letter was 1 page. It said that Arlo Vance had arrived in Cheyenne 36 hours ago with a signed statement regarding land transactions in Carver County. It said that Vance's statement, cross-referenced with documents received from a Marcus Kellerman acting on behalf of his family's prior claim, had given the Federal Land Office sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into the property records of Carver County dating from 1875 to the present. It said that a federal marshal and 2 agents would arrive in Stone Ridge within 48 hours. It said, and here the handwriting went slightly more deliberate, like Pruitt was choosing each word, that any detention related to local charges against a Silas Boone of Stone Ridge should be considered subject to federal review pending the outcome of the land investigation, and that the presiding county marshal had been so notified. Mara read it twice. Then she sat down in the kitchen garden in the dirt between the bean rows, which was not a dignified thing to do, and she pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes and breathed. Roy's brother-in-law, who had been watching from the barn, called over. "Good news?" "Go get Roy," she said. "Please. Now." She sat in the dirt until Roy came, which took 40 minutes, and then she stood up and gave him the letter and watched his face as he read it, and watched the moment when it landed. "Lord," Roy said softly. 48 hours, she said. "They need to hold Silas 48 more hours. Tilson's not going to want to release him early anyway. No, I mean they need to keep him safe for 48 hours, she said. If Harrow finds out federal marshals are coming before they arrive, Tilson's protection becomes a liability. Harrow will want to move." Roy looked at her. "You think he'd touch a man in custody?" "I think a man who burned a house with people in it has a fairly elastic sense of what he will and won't do," she said flatly. "I need someone watching that jail who isn't on Harrow's payroll." "Pete Foreman," Roy said immediately. "Pete Foreman," she agreed. She sent word to Pete, and she sent a second message to the writer from Cheyenne, a young man who was already tired and who agreed, for $1 and a meal from Ethel's stew, to carry a message back to Pruitt confirming receipt and asking for the earliest possible arrival. Then she went inside and told the girls. Clara listened to all of it. Her face moved through several things and settled on something that was not quite relief yet. She was her mother's daughter, and she didn't permit herself relief before it was earned. Lily listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Mara. When Mara finished, she said, "Is Silas coming home?" "In 2 days," Mara said. "Maybe sooner." Lily thought about that. "And then what happens?" "Then people who can fix this will come and do the fixing," Mara said, "and we stop running." Lily was quiet. The scar on her wrist caught the morning light, silvery and permanent. "I don't remember running," Lily said. "I just remember after." It was the most the child had said about any of it in the months since the fire, and Mara sat with it carefully, the way you sit with something fragile, and she said, "I know. And there's going to be an after to this part too, a good one." She didn't know that for certain. She was not a woman who made promises she couldn't keep, and she knew it. But she looked at the 6-year-old face and decided that this once, the promise was the right thing, and she would find a way to keep it. Harrow moved on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and it was not what anyone expected. He didn't go to the jail. He didn't go to the ranch. He walked into the Stone Ridge General Store at 3 in the afternoon, when there were 4 people in it, and he announced that he was withdrawing his support from the 3 local businesses he'd been extending credit to over the drought, effective immediately, which meant the general store's back inventory debt came due now, and the livery's equipment loan came due now, and the boarding house's emergency loan from 6 months ago came due now. It was not illegal. It was money he was owed. The timing was what it was, and everyone understood the timing, and that was the point. He wanted everyone to understand it. He wanted the Valley to see what supporting Silas Boone and Mara Whitlock cost. He wanted people to feel it in their wallets and their kitchens and their ability to keep their businesses open, and he wanted them to make a calculation about whether last night at the Grange Hall was worth this. Word reached Mara by 4 o'clock through Roy, who was pale with anger and doing something she'd rarely seen Roy do, which was not talk. She sat with it. She thought about the store owner who had 4 children, the livery man who was 63 and had built that business from nothing, the boarding house woman who was a widow and had been managing alone since her husband died 2 years before Mara arrived. She thought about all the ways Harrow won without using force, about how effective it was, about how many times in the past 15 years he had done exactly this, applied pressure that looked clean and legal and left marks that couldn't be shown in court. She got up and walked to the window and looked at the road. Then she went to the corner where the girls kept their things, and she found the small tin box where Clara kept the money she'd been saving. Clara saved everything. It was an old habit, and she emptied it on the table. $11. She had 32 of her own. She went to the place in the kitchen where she'd started quietly keeping what she earned from the ranch work, and she counted it. $67 total. Not enough. She knew it wasn't enough. She sat down and looked at the money and was honest with herself, which was her habit even when it was uncomfortable. $67 wouldn't cover what Harrow had just called in. It wasn't the point, anyway. The point was a demonstration, not actual debt relief. What could she do with $67 that made it mean something? She thought about that for 20 minutes. Then she went to Roy's. She found him at the feed store, still pacing, and she put $30 on his counter and said, "For the general store, toward the debt. I need you to take it there yourself, and I need you to tell them it came from the Boone Ranch, publicly, out loud." Roy stared at her. "This won't cover—" "I know," she said. "That's not what it's for. It's for visibility." She looked at him steadily. "Harrow made a public demonstration. We make a public counter-demonstration. It doesn't have to cover the debt. It has to show people that there's a side to be on." She paused. "People have been waiting for someone to go first. They don't want to go first alone." Roy looked at the money, looked at her, picked it up. He went to the general store. He put the $30 on the counter in front of the owner and 4 customers and said it was from Mara Whitlock and Silas Boone of the Mountain Ranch toward the Harrow debt as a matter of standing together. By 6 o'clock, the school teacher had brought $20. The Kellerman grandson had wired $15 from Cheyenne. Pete Foreman's wife had shown up at the general store with a ham and an amount of cash she'd kept from the household account, and she'd said, in a voice that carried across the entire store floor, that she'd been afraid of Harrow's reach for 6 years and she was done with it. Ethel Marsh closed her store an hour early and spent that hour going door to door on Main Street with a piece of paper and a quiet word about what had happened and what was at stake. She collected $214 before dark. None of it was enough to make Harrow's calls irrelevant. That wasn't the point, and everyone who gave knew it. The point was what Roy had said publicly in that store, what the school teacher had put her name next to, what Ethel Marsh had spent her evening hour doing. The point was that the Valley was making a count, and the count was not coming out the way Harrow expected. The federal marshals arrived the following morning, not 48 hours but 31, because Pruitt had understood something about timelines. There were 3 of them. They came in fast and without announcement, and the first stop they made was the Carver County Jail, where they served notice on Tilson that Silas Boone was to be released immediately pending federal review of the underlying charges. Tilson looked at the paperwork, at the federal badges, at the 3 men who were not going to be moved, and he released Silas Boone. Roy was outside the jail when Silas came out. He looked at Silas, and Silas looked at him, and Roy said, "A lot happened." "Tell me," Silas said. "In the wagon," Roy said. "It's a lot." It was a lot. Roy talked the entire 2-hour drive up the mountain and was still talking when they pulled into the yard, and Silas sat in the wagon seat and listened to all of it. The federal letter, the general store, the $30, Pete's wife, Ethel Marsh going door to door in the evening with a piece of paper, and he listened to it with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something significant. "Mara," he said. "Did all of it," Roy said. "I delivered the money and said the words. Everything else was her." The house door opened and the girls came out first. Lily came at a run and made contact with Silas's legs the moment he stepped off the wagon, both arms around him, face pressed into his coat, saying nothing at all. And Silas put one hand on the back of her head and stood very still. Clara came and stood nearby. She looked at him with those watchful eyes. "You're all right," she said. "I'm all right," he said. Mara came last, standing in the door, and she looked at him across the yard with an expression that was more honest than he'd seen from her yet. Not guarded, not reassembled, just open, just her, just the face of a woman who had done what she could and was glad it was enough and was not going to pretend she wasn't. He crossed the yard to her, and Lily moved with him, still holding on, and he stopped at the porch step and looked at Mara. "Roy told me," he said. "Roy talks," she said. "He does," Silas agreed. "He told me about the $30. She looked at him. "It wasn't about the money." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." She held his gaze for a moment. The porch between them, the lamp in the window behind her, the yard full of Roy and Pete, and the particular quiet of a mountain morning that had not yet been asked what it was going to become. "The Marshalls are in Stone Ridge," she said. "I saw them," he said. "They need the documents." "Then let's go get them," he said. She nodded once, looked at Lily, still attached to Silas's coat. She reached down and took the child's hand. They went up the tree line together, all four of them, Silas and Mara and Clara and Lily. In the morning light, through the dry grass of the back pasture, toward the granite overhang where the documents had been waiting in the dark for 9 days like a held breath waiting to be released. Silas moved the flat stone, took out the oilcloth packet, unwrapped it carefully. The papers were dry and intact and exactly as they'd left them. He handed them to Mara. She took them with both hands and stood for a moment looking at them. The land survey, the ledger page, the 2 broken seal letters, the record of everything that had been done and hidden and carried through 3 towns and 2 states in 1 catastrophic night and 11 months of silence. Clara was looking at her mother. Lily was looking at the papers with the wide, solemn eyes of a child who does not fully understand what she is seeing, but understands that it is important. "Is that what saves us?" Lily asked. Mara looked at her. "It's part of it," she said. "The other part is already done." She folded the papers carefully, put them under her arm, and they walked back down the mountain toward whatever came next, in the morning light, together. The 3 federal marshals set up in the Stone Ridge Grange Hall, which was the largest indoor space in town and which still smelled faintly of the meeting 4 nights ago. Lamp oil and nervous people and the particular residue of a room where something important happened. They brought their own paperwork, their own process, and a quiet authority that was different from the county kind. The county kind leaned on who it knew. The federal kind leaned on what it could prove, and what it could prove in this case was considerable. Marshal Aldous Pruitt had sent his best man. His name was Daniel Croft, and he was 40-something with a precise manner and no interest in local politics, which was exactly the right combination for what needed doing. He read through the documents in the first 2 hours. The land survey, the ledger page, the 2 letters, Vance's signed statement, with the focused attention of a man reading a map of somewhere he's about to walk, and when he finished, he set them down and looked at Mara across the table. "These are clean," he said. "I know they're clean," she said. "I mean legally clean. Chain of custody is intact. Provenance is documentable." He tapped the ledger page. "This alone is enough to open the Carver County Clerk's office. With Vance's statement and the land survey, we can freeze every property transfer Harrow has made since 1875 pending review." He paused. "All of them." Silas, sitting beside Mara, said, "How many?" Croft looked at his notes. "Based on what you've provided and what Kellerman documented from Cheyenne, we're looking at a minimum of 11 separate transactions. Could be more once we're in the county records." He looked at both of them. "This is going to take time to fully resolve. Months, possibly longer. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," Mara said. "It also means Harrow is going to have lawyers, good ones. He'll contest every document and every testimony, and he'll do it in the most expensive and time-consuming way he can afford. He looked at her steadily. He can afford a great deal. I know that too, she said. I've known it for 11 months. Croft nodded. Then you also know that the most important thing right now is securing additional testimony. People who have direct knowledge of these transactions, not just Vance, but the families affected. Anyone who was present for a meeting, who received an offer, who experienced pressure. Mara looked at Silas. Silas looked at Roy, who was standing against the wall because Roy had not left the Grange Hall since the marshals arrived, and seemed to have no intention of doing so. There are people in this valley who've been waiting for an invitation to speak, Roy said. They just needed to know it was safe to say yes. Then let's make it safe, Croft said. Us. What followed was not clean or fast, and it was not a parade of brave people lining up to do the right thing. That was not how real things worked, and everyone in that room understood it. What happened was slower and more complicated and more human than that. Roy went first. He gave a formal statement about Harrow's public debt calling after the Grange meeting, the timing, the targeted businesses, the explicit connection between community support for Silas Boone and the sudden financial pressure. It was circumstantial, but it was documented by the school teacher's records, and it showed a pattern of economic coercion that the federal investigation would be able to stack against the larger pattern in the land transactions. The store owner came the next morning. He sat in the Grange Hall with his hat in his hands and told Croft about 2 conversations he'd had with Briggs in 2879. Conversations in which Briggs had made very clear that a feed store's access to Harrow's supply chain was contingent on the feed store owner maintaining what Briggs called a cooperative community posture. He had not fully understood it at the time, or he had understood it and chosen to believe it was standard business. He understood it now. He said so. His voice cracked once, near the end, and he didn't apologize for it. The boarding house widow came on the second day. She had a memory like a ledger herself, dates, amounts, exact phrases. She had written things down, she said, because she'd had a feeling she might need them. She'd been carrying that feeling for 4 years. Pete Foreman brought 2 ranchers from the North Valley who had adjacent properties to the Kellerman place and who had felt the shape of what happened without being able to name it. They named it now. Ethel Mars came on the 3rd day. She did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the Grange Hall and gave her statement standing up. The same way she'd spent 30 years in Stone Ridge standing up, and she said, I knew something was wrong with how this valley was moving. I chose to believe it didn't affect me. I am telling you now that I was wrong and that I am prepared to say so in front of any judge who needs to hear it. Then she sat down, and her face had the look of a person who has set down a heavy thing and is still feeling the ghost weight of it in their arms. Not everyone came. That was the truth of it. 3 families who had been directly affected by Harrow's land acquisitions, who had lost property, who had the clearest and most powerful testimony to give, did not come. 2 of them sent quiet word through Roy that they were afraid, that Harrow's reach was long and the federal process was slow, and they had children and they couldn't. Mara received that word and held it without judgment, because she had spent 11 months being afraid with children, and she knew exactly the calculation those families were making. The 3rd family sent no word at all, and Mara thought about them sometimes in the weeks that followed, wondered what they were carrying, whether it was fear or something that had curdled into something else over the years, the particular bitterness of people who have been wronged so long they don't trust the idea of it being fixed. She couldn't fix that. She knew she couldn't fix that. It was one of the things she had to learn to let sit. Cleet Briggs was arrested on the 4th day. He did not go quietly, which surprised no one who had thought about it, and he went loudly in the middle of Main Street, which surprised everyone who witnessed it. He said several things about Harrow and about himself and about the federal marshals that were informative in their specificity, and Croft listened to all of it without expression and then had him transported to Cheyenne. Briggs began cooperating within 48 hours of his arrival, which also surprised no one who understood that men like Briggs are loyal to the arrangement, not to the man, and when the arrangement becomes a liability, the loyalty goes with it. His cooperation opened doors that the documents alone couldn't open. Specific conversations, specific instructions, the names of 2 additional county officials who had been receiving payments and whose cooperation had made the forged property records possible. One of those officials fled before he could be served. The other surrendered, and his surrender came with a ledger of his own, which he had kept for reasons he explained as self-preservation, and which turned out to be the most comprehensive financial record of Harrow's operations that anyone had produced. Harrow himself was served at his home on a Friday morning, 11 days after the marshals arrived in Stone Ridge. Silas heard about it from Roy, who heard about it from Pete Foreman's son, who had been on the South Road at the right moment. He came up the mountain with the news in the early afternoon and stood in the yard and said, "They got him." Silas was at the fence line, the one that kept needing attention, the ones that always would, and he set down his tools and stood for a moment looking at the valley spread below the ranch. He didn't feel what he expected to feel. He thought he might feel something large, something commensurate with 11 months of Mara's carrying and 2 years of watching Harrow move through the valley like weather. What he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, the particular release of a thing held so long that you've forgotten the tension of holding it, and when it goes, you mostly just feel tired in a way that isn't bad. He went inside. Mara was at the table, and she looked at his face when he came in and read it before he said anything. "Harrow," she said, "served this morning." She was quiet. Her hands were on the table and she looked at them. "Okay," she said, not triumphant, just real. He sat down across from her. "How are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave most questions, which was considerable. "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been pointed at this for so long. I'm not sure I know how to point somewhere else." "That takes time," he said. "I know." She looked up at him. "The hearing for Lily's claim is in 6 weeks, Cheyenne." "I know," he said. "I'll be there." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to." "Mara," he said. She stopped. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'll be there." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the sound of Clara and Lily somewhere in the yard, the particular rising and falling of their voices that had become in 30-odd days the sound of the house being alive. "There's something I want to ask you," Silas said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, and it was not the quietness of a man who didn't have the words, but the quietness of a man who had them and was being careful with them, the way you are careful with something that matters. "I know how you came here," he said. "I know it wasn't romantic, and it wasn't. I know what it was. And I know that things have changed since then, for me at least, and I think for you too, but I'm not going to assume." He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "I'd like to know if you're thinking about staying." She looked at him across the table. The man who had read her without demanding to read her, who had taken the documents up the tree line in the dark without being asked to, who had let himself be arrested without fighting it, because she'd said it was the right move, and he'd trusted her judgment over his own frustration, who had shown up at the fence when she told him not to fight it, and had not fought it, who had put his hand on the back of Lily's head in the yard when she ran to him and stood very still, like the child was something he was afraid of breaking and didn't want to risk moving wrong. "I'm thinking about staying," she said. He nodded. "I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't know how to do this. The regular kind of this. I've been in crisis mode for so long that I'm not sure I know what I'm like without it." "I don't know what you're like without it either," he said. "I'd like to find out." She looked at him. Something in her face, the guarded part, the assembled part, the part that had been keeping everything managed and contained since before she stepped off that stagecoach, moved. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slightly, like the first small shift in something that has been still for a very long time. "All right," she said, for the third time, but this time it sounded the way it was. The hearing in Cheyenne was 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday in September when the weather had finally broken, and the sky over the high country was the kind of blue that feels like an apology from a long, difficult summer. They all went. That was a decision made without discussion and without fanfare. Silas said he would drive, Mara said she needed 3 days to prepare, Clara said she was going, and Lily said nothing about going because it had not occurred to her that she might not. So they went, all 4 of them, in the wagon with the good wheel and the one that still creaked, 2 days' drive south and east into the city. The federal land court was in a stone building that smelled like paper and old wood, and the hallways had a hush that was different from the mountain kind. A formal hush. The hush of a place where words are written down and kept. Lily held Mara's hand the entire way from the entrance to the courtroom, which was a room with high windows and rows of benches and a judge's bench at the front that was raised enough to feel like a statement. Arlo Vance was there. He was sitting in the second row, turned slightly away from everyone else, and he looked worse and better than when they'd last seen him. Worse in the sense of thinner and more tired, better in the sense of a man who has put something down and can feel the difference in his posture. He looked at Mara when they came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke, but something passed between them that was acknowledgement without forgiveness, which was honest, and was probably all that was available, and maybe all that was needed. She sat between Silas and Clara in the second row and held the end of Silas's sleeve the same way she held the quilt when she slept, and Clara put an arm around her at one point and Lily leaned into it and stayed. Judge Fold deliberated for 40 minutes. She returned with a ruling that was, in her words, straightforward given the evidence presented. The Dunbar family spring and surrounding property, comprising 42 acres in Carver County, was to be restored to the estate of the minor child Lily Dunbar, with a legal guardian to be appointed by the court pending further proceedings. The forged county deed was voided, the chain of title was restored to the 1871 registration, and the matter of Lily Dunbar's legal identity, her name, her inheritance, her existence in the eyes of the law, was formally and irrevocably recognized. Lily Dunbar. She had been Lily for 11 months. Just Lily, the way children in crisis become just their first name, as though the last name is too much to carry. Now she had the whole thing back, officially, in a room with high windows and a judge who had said it out loud and written it down. Mara, sitting in the front row, heard the ruling and felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was made of both and was more honest than either alone. She had done what she'd said she would do. She had gotten Lily here. She had kept her here. She pressed her hand over her mouth for exactly 1 moment. Then she straightened up and turned to look at the second row. Lily was already looking at her. "Is that good?" Lily asked, in the particular practical voice of a 6-year-old who has been in a room full of serious adults for 4 hours and is keeping track. "That's very good," Mara said. "Do I still call you Mama?" The question landed in Mara's chest like a stone dropped in still water. She hadn't expected it. Not now, not in those words, not with that matter-of-fact directness that was somehow more devastating than any complicated version of it could have been. She looked at Lily, at the small face, the blonde hair, the scar on the wrist that was part of her history and would always be, at the child who had been playing in a backfield when the world ended and who had reached for Mara's hand in the running and had not fully let go since. "If you want to," Mara said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. Lily thought about it for about 2 seconds. "I want to," she said, and went back to holding Silas's sleeve. Harrow's trial was in the spring. It ran for 3 weeks and involved 11 land disputes, 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of fraud upon the court, and the financial records produced by the county official who had surrendered and cooperated. Briggs testified for the prosecution for 4 days. His testimony was comprehensive and specific and damaged Harrow in ways that documents alone could not, because documents show what happened and testimony shows how people decided to make it happen, and juries respond to the human machinery of a thing. Harrow had good lawyers. They were very good. They challenged every document, contested every provenance, suggested alternate interpretations of the ledger page with a creativity that was almost impressive. They could not explain Vance. They could not explain Briggs. And they could not explain 11 families who each told the same story in the same shape, because when 11 people independently describe the same pattern, you stop being able to call it coincidence and you start having to call it what it is. Mara did not attend the trial. She had given her deposition, and Croft had told her the deposition was sufficient, and she had made a decision that she did not want to spend 3 weeks sitting in a courtroom watching the machinery of justice work itself out. She had done her part. The rest belonged to the process. Instead, she was on the mountain. She was in the kitchen garden, which had come back fully now that the rains had finally returned in October. And the garden in April was everything it had promised to be in July, when Mara had arrived and found it dying. She was on her knees in the soil doing the work that required being on your knees in soil, and she was fine with that, because the work that required being on your knees was also the work that grew things. Clara brought her the news when the telegram arrived, because Silas was in the upper pasture and Clara was faster, and also because Clara was Clara. Guilty, Clara said from the garden gate. On all counts. Mara sat back on her heels. She had known the evidence was strong. She had believed it was enough. But believing something and hearing the word guilty applied to Gideon Harrow by a jury of his county were different experiences, and she sat in the garden for a moment and felt the difference between them. All counts, she said. All of them, Clara said. Roy got the telegram an hour ago. He's already told half the valley. Mara looked at her hands, soil in the creases, the garden around her doing what gardens do when left to their actual business. The mountain above, which had looked down on all of this without opinion and would continue to do so. Go find Lily, she said. Tell her too. She should hear it from you. Clara looked at her. Why me? Because you're the one who kept her safe when I couldn't be there, Mara said. You earned the telling. Something in Clara's face, the careful, managed face, the face that had been so much older than 9 for as long as Mara could remember, went briefly and completely young. It was there for a second and then gone, replaced by the familiar, dignified composure. But it had been there. Okay, Clara said, and went. The 11 families received their land back over the following 8 months. Not all of it. Some of the properties had been developed in ways that couldn't be fully reversed, and the legal work of untangling a decade of forged deeds was slow and imperfect, and produced results that were just rather than perfect. Mara had stopped expecting perfect. Perfect was not a thing the world offered, just was what you fought for, and just was what she had fought for, and just was mostly what they got, which was more than they'd had in October when she stepped off a stagecoach with a secret and 2 children and a town that looked at her like a problem. 3 families rebuilt on their original land. 2 accepted financial settlements instead. One because the land had been sold to someone who hadn't known it was stolen, an innocent buyer who also lost money in the unraveling, and nobody wanted to make the innocent pay for the guilty, so settlements were negotiated that were imperfect but possible. 3 families used what they recovered to start over somewhere else entirely. 2 did something nobody predicted. They came back to Stone Ridge and built adjacent to what they'd had, taking what they could reclaim and making peace with the rest, because home is sometimes where you return to, not because everything is the same, but because nowhere else has ever fit the same way. The county clerk's office was reorganized entirely under federal oversight, and the new clerk was a woman from outside the territory who had no prior relationships in Carver County and no debts to the old arrangement. She kept meticulous records. She published monthly summaries of property transactions in the local paper. Sunlight turned out to be an effective deterrent, as it tends to be. Tilson resigned before charges could be formally brought, which meant he avoided prison but not the loss of the badge and the position and the reputation he'd spent 20 years building. He went north. Nobody heard much from him after that. The Dunbar Spring ran clear through that first summer after the judgment, which was the summer after the drought broke, and the water that came from it reached the valley floor and fed 3 separate creek tributaries and the kitchen gardens of 11 neighbors who had been hauling water by hand since June of the previous year. Lily understood the spring better than anyone explained it to her, which was the thing about Lily. She didn't need to be told the value of water by someone who hadn't been thirsty. She'd been thirsty. She knew. She went to the spring every morning through that summer, not as a ceremony, not as a performance of anything, but because mornings were when she did her thinking, and the spring was where her thinking was clearest. She was 7 by then, almost 8, growing in the fast particular way of children who have been given enough food and enough safety and enough space to grow into whatever they were always going to be. She talked to the horses still. Silas had stopped thinking of it as a quirk and started thinking of it as a skill. She had a way with them that he'd only seen in a few people in his life, the kind of way that isn't trained, just present. She understood how they held their fear, and she knew how to let them put it down. And he thought sometimes that she understood this from the inside in a way that most people couldn't. He was teaching her to ride by September. Clara already rode well. Clara did most things well, in the way of people who approach everything as a problem to be solved. But Lily rode differently. She rode like someone who was having a conversation. Clara, watching from the fence one afternoon, said to Mara, "She's going to be better at that than any of us." "Yes," Mara said. "That doesn't bother you?" "Why would it bother me?" Clara considered. "I don't know. I thought maybe it would." Mara looked at her oldest daughter, at the girl who had read primers in lamplight while her mother held a secret who had come to Silas in the barn and given him the information that needed giving, who had kept Lily quiet in the dark when strange men looked through windows, who had turned 12 in August and had spent that birthday in the kitchen making her own cake because she wanted it done right and trusted nobody else with the proportions. "You rode like that too," Mara said. "The first time." Clara looked at her. "When you were 6, before things got hard, you rode like you were asking the horse a question." Mara looked back at Lily on the horse. "It's a good way to ride." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember that." "I do," Mara said. They stood at the fence together, and the afternoon light was the September kind that has a particular warmth to it, the warmth of something on its way out giving everything it has left before it goes, and neither of them said anything else about it. Silas married Mara in October. Not in a church, because the nearest church was 11 miles away, and neither of them were the kind for churches. They stood on the porch of the ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday again, the day nothing good was supposed to arrive in Stone Ridge, which they'd decided to use differently, with Roy Casper present because Roy had obtained the authority to perform civil ceremonies in a burst of civic ambition 2 months prior, and with Pete Foreman and his wife and Ethel Mars and Clara and Lily as witnesses. It was not a long ceremony. Silas had no interest in long ceremonies, and Mara had no patience for words that circled instead of landed. Roy said what needed to be said. They said what they meant to each other, which was brief and direct in the way of people who have already done the harder work of proving it through action and don't need the words to carry more than they actually weigh. Ethel cried. Nobody mentioned it, and she did not acknowledge it, and they all pretended not to notice except Clara, who noticed everything, and who stored it away in the particular way she stored things that surprised her. Lily wore her good dress, which she objected to on the grounds that it had a ribbon she found unnecessary, and Mara let her remove the ribbon, and they didn't argue about it, which felt like a kind of miracle to both of them in its own small way. At some point in the afternoon, when the practical part was done and people had moved into the easy territory of food and conversation, Silas found himself standing at the edge of the porch looking at the ranch in the October light. The garden was wound down for the season. The barn roof, repaired now fully, showed no more soft spots. The fence lines ran straight out to the property edges in every direction, recently walked, recently tended. The mountain above had its first cold color at the tree line. He'd been on this land for 16 years. He knew every fence post and every soft spot in the soil, and every place where water moved underground, and every place it didn't. He'd built most of what stood here himself, and he'd worn himself down doing it, and after Eleanor he'd maintained it the way you maintain things when maintenance is all you have left. He was looking at it differently now. Not because it was different, because he was. Mara came and stood beside him. She had a coffee cup. She always had a coffee cup. It was a habit he'd learned not to read as inattention because the coffee was never the point. And she stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. "You're thinking something," she said. "Usually," he said, "specific." He was quiet a moment. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. "She would have fought with you constantly and liked you very much." Mara looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "She only fought with people she respected," he said. "She was very efficient about where she spent her energy." Mara looked back at the ranch. "I would have liked her too," she said. "Probably." "Probably," he agreed. From inside the house, Lily could be heard telling Pete Foreman's wife something at length, in the serious and detailed way that Lily explained things she cared about. The wife was apparently a good listener, because the explanation went on for some time. Clara's voice cut in once to correct a detail, and Lily said she knew that and had been getting to it, and Clara said she'd been waiting, and it sounded like a conversation between siblings, which was what it was. The lamp came on inside as the afternoon light dropped, the way it did every evening, the light visible through the kitchen window in a long yellow line across the porch boards. Silas had put that lamp in the window the night Mara went for Vance, and it had burned there every night since, because the house needed a light you could see from the road, and because there was always the chance someone needed to know where the house was, and because sometimes the reason you keep a light burning is not about the person you're keeping it for, but about what it makes you into, the person who keeps it. He looked at the lamp. He thought about the 32 people in the Grange Hall, about Roy going door to door in the dark, about Vance sitting in Birch Hollow with 18 months of guilt on his conscience and choosing, when it mattered, to let it count for something. About Ethel Mars on the porch steps with a covered dish and a reckoning. About Lily in the back field the night the Dunbar house burned, being small and oblivious to what was being lost behind her, and Mara running toward her instead of away, which was the decision that had built everything that came after. None of those people had been heroes. None of them had been clean or uncomplicated or free of the years of looking away that preceded the moment when they stopped. They had been people. Specific, flawed, frightened people who had at some point, at different points, in different rooms, for different reasons, decided that the cost of staying quiet was now higher than the cost of speaking. That was the whole of it, really. That was what this valley had learned, if it had learned anything. Not that good defeats evil, because good and evil were too large and too clean, and this had not been either of those. What it had learned was that silence is not neutral, that silence is a choice, and the choice has consequences. And the consequences eventually come back around to the person who chose silence. And at that point, you either make the same choice again, or you don't. Most people, given enough time and enough evidence, and at least one other person going first, choose differently. Most people. Not all, but most. He crouched down beside her, which put them at the same level, and he looked at the spring and then at her. "That's a big decision," he said. "You're 8. "I know," she said. "I'm going to make it anyway." He almost smiled. "Does your mother know you talk like that?" "She says I get it from her." "She's right," he said. They stayed at the spring for a while longer, in the April morning, with the water running clear and the mountain above them doing what mountains do, which is to say nothing and mean everything. And eventually they walked back down the hill toward the ranch where Mara and Clara were, where the kitchen light was on and the coffee was likely made, and the day was asking what they were going to do with the rest of it. The lamp burned in the window all that spring, all that summer. Through the next drought, which came 2 years later and was bad but not catastrophic, partly because the Dunbar spring fed what it fed, and people knew where to go and were told they were welcome. It burned through the years that followed, which had their own griefs and their own ordinary difficulties. The fence that always needed tending, the seasons that didn't cooperate, the mornings that were hard for no specific reason, which is the kind of hard that is somehow worse to explain. It burned through the good years too, which came, as they do when you make enough room for them. Clara left for Cheyenne at 17 to study, which everyone who knew her had known was coming, and she came back at 22 with skills and opinions and the same jaw, and she built something of her own in the valley that would have made a person who didn't know her assume it had been easy. Lily stayed. That surprised some people and surprised no one who actually knew her. She stayed and she managed the spring, and she managed it the way her father had meant it to be managed, which was generously, and the valley did not forget it. Silas's hair went gray. Mara's went gray later, which she considered a personal victory, and he considered irrelevant because he'd stopped looking at her, and seeing how she looked sometime in the first year, and started looking at her and just seeing her, which was different. They argued. They were both too certain of their own judgment to live in the same house without arguing, and they argued about serious things and small things with approximately the same intensity, which drove Clara to distraction, and which Lily found privately reassuring because she'd decided early on that people who argued meant they were still saying things to each other. The ranch got better, not because everything worked, but because they worked at it, the way things actually get better, which is incrementally and with setbacks, and with the occasional year where everything you planned goes sideways, and you build the next year out of what's left. And the lamp burned in the window, not as a symbol, not as a statement, just because it was practical, because the road up the mountain was dark and a light was useful, because you never knew who might be on the road at the wrong hour, lost or afraid, or carrying something too heavy for one person. Because that was the thing about a light. It didn't ask what you deserved. It didn't require you to explain yourself before it helped you see. It just burned, and if you needed it, it was there. That was enough. That had always been enough.